Thank you, Steven, and thank you everyone for being here. It's a great honor to present our research and our creative activity in this way. So our topic today is the music of dialect, and so we thought a good place to begin is what is dialect? Well, dialects are regionally or socially distinct speech patterns, and as I'm sure you all know, it is often possible to tell where a person is from based on the way that they speak. The differences between dialects may involve not only pronunciations or accents, but also distinct vocabularies and grammatical formations. In general, the differences between dialects are not considered strong enough to warrant designation as a separate language, and distinct dialects of the same language are still mutually intelligible to one another, although, of course, some present greater intelligibility challenges than others. And we are focusing today on the dialects of our home province of Newfoundland and Labrador, as Steve and myself are both native Newfoundlanders. So the province is home to perhaps the greatest regional diversity of spoken English in North America. The dialects of the mainland portion of the province, or Labrador, are significantly different from those of the island portion, Newfoundland. While we would love to one day include Labrador in our study, the island is home to the vast majority of the province's population, and it already presents a staggering diversity of dialects, more than we could possibly hope to exhaustively cover in a project of this nature. So this, combined with logical reasons, convinced us to limit our study to the island of Newfoundland, at least for the time being. Newfoundland was an independent country until Confederation with Canada in 1949. It is Britain's oldest transatlantic colony and Canada's newest province. Because the island's original settlements were originally tiny fishing villages with only marine access to one another or to the outside world, they became little crucibles of dialectal evolution, proceeding along a different pace and trajectory than mainland North America. In general, the distinct speech patterns still heard in Newfoundland today are quite conservative, bearing closer allegiance to the speech of the original European settlers who landed there than most other North American dialects. Those speech patterns are therefore still understood in terms of their settlement history, the two most dominant ones being Newfoundland British English, or NBE, and Newfoundland Irish English, or NIE. Now, these derived from extremely localized founder populations. Most of the settlers came from the southwest counties of England, in particular Dorset, Devon, Somerset, and Hampshire, and also from Ireland, specifically Waterford, Wexford, Carlow, Kilkenny, Tipperary, and Cork. Many people think of Newfoundland dialects as predominantly Irish-influenced, and this is partly because the dialect of the capital city of St. John's is of Irish provenance. But geographically speaking, the majority of the island is of British lineage. There are a few other pockets of historical influence, including some French and some Scottish. There are still a few native French speakers in the province today, but Newfoundland is an intensely Anglophone province. And even among those small pockets of French influence that remain, it is increasingly common to find young people who may speak English with a French-influenced accent, but who no longer speak French themselves as a native language. The Scottish presence is largely due to people who originally settled in Nova Scotia, which of course means New Scotland, and then resettled from there back to the west coast of Newfoundland. So the distinct and diverse dialects of Newfoundland have attracted considerable attention and research and have been documented in the Dictionary of Newfoundland English, published in 1982, a comprehensive study of Newfoundland and Labrador dialects published in 2010 by linguist Sandra Clark, and an interactive online dialect atlas published in 2015. And we're going to just have a quick look at a couple of those right now to give you a flavor for what we're talking about. So here is the Dictionary of Newfoundland English, and I'm going to start by showing you this word angashore, which means a poverty-stricken creature or a weak, sickly person, an unlucky person deserving pity, frequently preceded by poor. And if we go down to the second definition, we get a flavor for what I suspect is the etymology of the word, meaning a man regarded as too lazy to fish, a worthless fellow, a sluggard, a rascal, sometime merges with sense 3, which is an idle or mischievous child or person, or a sleveen. And so an angashore would have been somebody who would hang ashore or stay back on the shore while other men would go out in the boats to go fishing. And they're not all words that are distinct. Sometimes it's distinct usages as well. And so I want to have a look at this word odds over here. So odds means difference, consequences, especially in the phrase what odds, or perhaps that's no odds, which is what people in Newfoundland might say to express indifference, like to say, oh, that's no big deal, that's no odds. So this is an example where it's not a distinct word or not even necessarily a distinct pronunciation that sets it apart, but it's more of a connotation that makes it part of the Newfoundland dialect. By which I suppose I should say one of the many Newfoundland dialects, because the next place that we visit is the Dialect Atlas of Newfoundland and Labrador, which shows us just how diverse these speech patterns are depending on where you are in the province. First off, if you want to know about the whole province, you can click down here. And we might ask about grammar and see all kinds of different specific words and specific forms of words and specific grammatical formations that are different. Then there's pronunciation, if we click right here. And so we see things like H addition or H deletion. So sometimes if a word begins with a vowel without an H, in certain dialects in Newfoundland, an H will be added, or vice versa. If there's a word like house that begins with an H, the H might disappear to become ouse, or that kind of thing. And then there's a list of the different distinct words over here. So then that's for the island as a whole. If in addition to that we're interested in the particular speech patterns of a given community, we can say we're interested in Bayvert right here. Then we can see here are the distinct things about speech in that particular community that sets it apart, and here are some things about the pronunciation that set it apart. So quite a lot of very specific research has been done to document these distinct speech patterns, because they are so interesting and so different from what we see in most of the rest of mainland North America. And as Sandra Clark has noted, for many North Americans, the differences separating Newfoundland and Labrador English from their own are sufficiently great to cause comprehension difficulties, as is well known due to frequent appearances of our dialects in Canadian popular culture. But as with dialects all over the world, the dialects of Newfoundland, which originally developed due to geographic isolation, are slowly declining. Partly as a result of mass communication and easier travel. Researchers on dialects in Newfoundland stress that these dialects are not yet critically threatened. And while they acknowledge the sharp decline in particular speech features, they point out that language and dialect are always in a continual state of evolution. And they caution against an over-romanticized dying dialects narrative. Even so, they acknowledge that dialects tend to be more pronounced among older people, and that younger people tend to be bidialectal, having more than one speech pattern that they can activate depending on the situation, perhaps having a more distinct regional flavor in their speech when they're among friends and family, and a more formal, generic tone of speech when they're in a more formal situation. And as Clark notes, the province's current period of socioeconomic change and restructuring may well be accompanied by rapid language change, particularly in rural communities. For us, so-called townies, from the capital city without much of a strong Newfoundland accent, the decline of regional dialects is in a way sad, as we see it as part of a beautiful cultural heritage that we are proud to share. And indeed, for many, there is a strong sense of pride in dialect, rooted in a sense of connection to place and also in its inherent beauty.
Newfoundland identity. We have our own identity, we have our own dialect, right? I'm hoping people are not changing the way they speak because somebody says this is how you should do it. It's our own. It's our own.
But we are also people who have navigated the world outside of Newfoundland without suffering any of the negative consequences that can come with having a strong dialect. The butt of many jokes, and sometimes perceived as a sign of poor education or lack of social standing, dialects can be perceived as a personal liability, and in some cases are actively suppressed by things like dialect reduction therapy.
I have witnessed people in public places where people have laughed and made fun of people because of their dialect, and made it seem like they weren't as smart just because they didn't sound as grand as someone else. I think it is a problem if you're self-conscious, because then you say less and you don't get your point across, and if you don't talk, people don't hear you, so you get left behind.
We are now both expat Newfoundlanders who have lived in Quebec for a number of years, and we've been impressed by the passion with which Quebecers defend the French language against the changing linguistic tides. Believing as we do that dialectal diversity is part of what makes the world rich and a major part of what makes our home province unique, we sought to do what small part we can in changing the culture around dialect. Incorporating dialect in our own artistic practice and creating this research project around it, which we are proud to present to you here today, hoping to highlight it as a source of pride and combat the stigma that creates for some a sense of shame. We decided to celebrate the dialects of our home province while they are still a living reality, by researching them and using them in artistic work. We would tour the island of Newfoundland, recording interviews as we went with many people representing the dialectal diversity of the province, and use these recordings as the basis for new electroacoustic compositions, which would serve as a platform to recontextualize a cultural heritage that has at times been denigrated as unsophisticated. And so here's a map of our tour. We were often recording in very informal environments, in people's kitchens and whatnot, and it was very difficult to control for background noise. In order to maintain an informal tone in the conversation so that people felt relaxed in speaking, it was also sometimes difficult to control the mic placement, especially for people who were not used to being recorded. And so as a result, the recording quality varies a fair bit between one interview and the next, but we were kind of fond of the homey feeling that created at times. So we began down here on the Cape Shore of St. Mary's Bay in a town called Branch, which is a very Irish part of the province, and encountered there one of the very strongest dialects of all that poses intelligibility challenges even for people who are from the province.
He must be well up in around about 86 or 87 now. So they got some of these songs. And his mother, their mother, she plays on the organ and she can sing and play them besides. So she keeps the kind of music going, the Irish music going the whole time.
And the next place along the tour was in a British part of the province called Bay Roberts, and here's that.
I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone up Southern Shore who is not proud of how they sound. I really would find that hard to believe. And down in Cove, you put them at a party, you'd almost need an interpreter.
And just a couple of communities over in the town of Freshwater, another but pretty different British influence accent.
Oh, I think it's more. I think it's more important. There's more of it on the go now, I think. Yeah. I think it's more people at it, I think. More people at it, and I suppose a lot of people comes out to the hall out there, I tell you, from all over the place, and plays and sing. They're good. Some are excellent. Yes, in my books now, of course that don't go very far.
Now this town up here, Tilting, I think deserves a little bit of a special mention because this whole part of the province is very, very British. And there's just this one tiny community, this one little pocket on Fogo Island, and it is as Irish as if it were actually part of Ireland itself. It's incredible, absolutely distinct community, and the person we interviewed describes that in this clip.
But, and again, when we get visitors from Ireland, they say they come here and it's like the Connemara area, because I know from being in Connemara, it's the rocky terrain, you know, and that of course has beauty of its own.
And once again, the next town over has a British-influenced accent.
Like the songs that I've done in there myself personally, there's every song. I mean, I wrote about, I don't know, 50 plus songs, right? But every one, it's you know, there's a feeling, there's a meaning behind it. It's about something, you know, that's not going to be here eventually, and it's about preserving stuff, keeping stuff, and if not that, trying to keep it alive and remember it, you know, right? And so it never goes away, right?
Now, most of the people you've heard so far were, you know, in their 50s or 60s or older. Now, here's an example of somebody who was more like in their late 20s.
And I have to say that, to me, it seems like this Port-au-Port Peninsula holds a sense of pride, like, within one another anyways. So I think it's just, like, happy to have somebody out there that has a different type of heritage and also a different type of culture within their lives, even though they're only 40 minutes away.
And we had to look long and hard for the last two examples because, as we alluded to, the French and Scottish influence are more in little pockets. But we did find a good example of each one right out on the tip of the Port-au-Port Peninsula in a town called Cape St. George.
I mean, as in our time, my time, everybody played accordion and violin. Everybody, in every house.
Yeah.
Yeah, four or five people played the accordion. I mean, now time, because you could buy the accordion, right? Not something like that now, you know, just button ones. But everybody played the accordion, 2 or 3. What kind of entertainment would you have? Other than that, you had to learn to play the accordion, something to do, you know.
And Scottish influenced dialect that we found down in the Codroy Valley.
He was called a piper of the valley, and I mean, like they say, they remember him back in the day, like on a Sunday afternoon, playing the pipes outside of his place there on the hill, and you could hear the pipes for right across the river, and like, it was amazing.
So altogether we had, I think, 16 interviews and 18 hours of recorded footage that we spent the best part of a year going through and deciding what to use. Let's say that at the outset our interest was purely phonetic, and it was the sound of the speech that interested us and which we sought to incorporate into a musical context. But earning their reputation for hospitality, the Newfoundlanders that we spoke with were so open and generous and shared so many touching stories and personal insights with us that we began to understand that there was a great emotional and narrative resource here as well, and that it would be a serious missed opportunity to ignore that. So we thus kind of reconceived the project a bit to include stories as well as speech. And we refashioned it into a multi-phase project that will include several compositions. One of these will be a large-scale piece with multiple movements that will each explore a different phonetic or narrative feature based on the interviews that we collected. And the composition that we will premiere for you at the end of this presentation is the first movement of that piece. For this movement, we have used only a small number of speech samples, only 3, and we've repeated them each several times. They are chosen to highlight the rhythm of dialect, the melody of dialect, and the harmony of dialect, respectively, in ways that will become clear as we describe the various ways that dialect can interact with music. So because we are musicians, and because the folk song tradition in Newfoundland is still very much alive and very strong, and many people feel a great connection to it, our conversations were frequently about music. The delivery of folk songs is, of course, closely connected to dialect. If a Newfoundland folk song is sung with a generic accent, it will simply not sound like a Newfoundland folk song. So here is the first point of convergence that we are drawing between dialect and music in the folk song tradition. Now, we were there to talk with people, but to our surprise and delight, some of our participants voluntarily sang for us without any prompting. And although we were both well-versed in Newfoundland folk song tradition, most of the songs that we heard were new to us. They were discoveries. And one of our very favorite examples was from the town of Tilting, which I mentioned earlier, and I'd like to play you a verse of that song right now.
Alone in his workshop, a young Tyler there, with his tools scattered round him, sat down in despair. There's a rich man lives yonder, he mournfully cries, while his wife, kind and patient, drew near him and sighs. Don't sigh for the things that are not yours. Don't tell fate what to do. Don't envy those who seem to be much better off than you. For we'll all be judged by what we have done, and not by what we own. Be satisfied with what you've got, leave well enough alone.
In spite of the confidence, she had never sung before until a few years earlier. Her husband was a well-known local singer, and the song you've just heard was one of his signatures. And as several of our participants told us, it's often like that in Newfoundland. Particular songs are associated with particular people. It's not necessarily the case that there's just a bank of songs from which everybody can draw. Now, even without singing, there are inherently musical qualities in speech, which have long been recognized in poetry, rhetoric, and oration, as well as in stylized types of delivery such as chant, recitation, beat poetry, and rap, as well as the superposition of speech on music in narration. But in addition to these, and especially in recent times, there are some strains of music in which speech interacts with music, creating a kind of hybrid sound world that blurs the lines between the two, between speech and music. This was the approach that interested us, and let's look at a few ways that this has been achieved in the repertoire before talking a bit about our particular approach. So first of all is the melodic imitation of speech, in which instruments follow the contour and rhythm of vocal delivery. And there are many good examples of this. The one that we'd like to show you is by a Quebec composer named René Lucier from the piece Le Trésor de la Langue. And I'd just like to make a little disclaimer here. The words in this song are politically charged, and in using them, we are not intending to make any kind of a political statement whatsoever. We chose this piece because it's the best example we could find of the guitar mirroring prosodic speech melody.
Moi, entends ce qui se passe ici, et je puis vous dire qu'elle en vaudra mieux. Vive Montréal, vive le Québec. Vive le Québec libre.
So a second way that music and dialect, or music and speech, can interact is maybe a bit more technologically dependent and therefore maybe a bit more recent. And this involves digital analysis and resynthesis of speech. So what you see at the bottom of the screen there is a spectrogram. And so basically imagine that along the x-axis we have time, along the y-axis we have frequency, and the darkness, looking only at the gray and black stuff for now, represents the amount of sound energy in that part of the frequency spectrum. Now, over the top of that, we have some red dots and red lines, and these represent concentrated regions of energy in a speech pattern known as formants, and they are essential to vowel identification and speech intelligibility. So just to explain where this comes from, this is generated in a software known as Pratt, which is a great tool for anybody who's interested in analyzing the spectral and phonetic structure of speech. And it does an analysis on the incoming spectrum and reduces it to these formant tracks that you see in red here. And you can see that if you imagine the bottom line here being the pitch of the speech, the lines up top do not necessarily always move parallel to them. Sometimes they more or less do, and other times they differ quite a lot. So the formant structure of the sound is changing continuously, and that's what creates this impression of changing vowel color and changing phonemes that make speech intelligible. So there's quite a few of these things at any given point in this example. But although real voices contain a large number of sinusoids or simple sound components or formants at any given time, intelligible speech can actually be simulated using only 3 simple parts at a time. And so I'd like to give you an example of that right now. So try to understand what's being said here. Let's hear that one more time. Have we got it? Probably not. However, have a listen to this one.
She cut with her knife.
And now listen again. Okay? So it's at that level of simplicity, it's difficult to hear it without prompting. But with prompting, if you know what it is you're listening for, it kind of just snaps into place very quickly. And this is a tool that can be used in instrumental composition as well. The internal structure of the sound can be used as a model for instrumental sound production. And just about the best example of this that I know comes from composer Peter Ablinger. Now, what you see in this picture here is just any old piano. That is not a special piano, it is not an electronic piano, it is just a piano. But it is being played by a specially designed electronic device with 88 mechanical fingers, one for each key, that can be played with superhuman speed and accuracy. And so what he has done, in this example that we're going to see from his website right now, is to use speech as a spectral model and programmed these mechanical fingers to play the spectral structure on the piano. Now, once again, I think if you were to listen to that without the words, you'd find it very difficult to understand what was being said. But with that prompt, it's amazing how veridical it seems, how much like a voice it seems is coming through the piano. So, although plenty of contemporary musical examples have used speech, and have focused maybe on speech intelligibility at times, there have been relatively few that have focused specifically on dialects and on the difference between dialects as an aesthetic field to explore in the piece. But there is one notable exception that we would like to highlight, which is Encounters in the Republic of Heaven by composer Trevor Wishart. Now, his project is remarkably similar to ours. From 2010, he toured around northern England, where he's from, and collected lots of interviews with people representing different dialect families there. His project is different in that it is purely an electronic piece to be played through loudspeakers and does not involve a live performance element. But we are very impressed with the work that he's done, and we look to him as a great source of inspiration in our own project. So we'd like to play you 3 examples with contrasting speech patterns from his piece right now.
A circular needle is just what it says. It's a long needle about that length. It'll be about
roughly a yard, and it's got proper knitting sticks on the end, but the rest is wire. And you go round it, you've got to have a thread coming down through. A different coloured thread, a brightly coloured thread. Or else you'd be all mixed up if you didn't. Whatever I had to do, it's never ending. And it was beautiful. It's beautiful. And that's the circular needle. When you're doing anything circular.
I guess I'll say that another difference between this piece and ours is that every single sound in his entire hour-long or so composition is derived from the voice. So they might be processed in lots of different ways, but they all are vocal in their origins, whereas with ours, obviously, we've got some that are coming from the guitar and some coming from other sound sources. Here's clip number 2.
Yeah, it does. He's good company. When I'm on my own, you know. He's good company. He's talking all the time.
And number 3.
And then, before Edie sat in, I sat back in because I forgot all about the wet thing. Then my boat got soaking wet. Then, I woke with it on. I went in the push with it on, and then when I got out, I was in the airplane, still like yellow sing on. And then I went out of it.
We'd also like to mention Soundscape Composition, which is a movement in electronic music heavily associated with composers like Marie Schaefer, Barry Truax, and Hildegard Westerkamp in Vancouver. So this is the use of recognizable sound sources to create an imaginary environment for the listener, which may be very close to the kinds of sonic environments we encounter in real life, or it may be more abstract depending on the aesthetic goals of the piece. Soundscape compositions do not necessarily use speech sounds, but they often do, as in the example by Hildegard Westerkamp, which we're about to hear, in which the voice functions as a kind of narrator talking you through the soundscape as it evolves.
It's a calm morning. I'm on Kitts Beach in Vancouver. It's slightly overcast and very mild for January. It's absolutely wind still. The ocean is flat, just a bit rippled in places. Ducks are quietly floating on the water.
So in a case like this, one must make a decision of where you want to fall on what might at first seem like an unlikely continuum between musical composition on the one side and documentary on the other side. In the beginning, we were firmly on the composition side because, as I said, our interest was primarily phonetic. But as we progressed in the project, we found ourselves gravitating more and more towards a balance between the two, with the voices telling a story that contextualizes the music and therefore coming a little bit closer to the documentary side. This was especially the case in the first piece that we created in our project, called 1 Foot in the Past. And the specific narrative that we were dealing with in this case was the Battle of Beaumont-Hamel. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, the Battle of Beaumont-Hamel was a devastating tragedy for the people of Newfoundland and Labrador. It happened on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916. And in one battle that lasted less than a half hour, basically half a generation of the young men from a tiny, struggling country were wiped out. And this dealt a crippling blow that is still felt today, that is still a living scar in the province today, even 100 years later. So because we were touring just prior to the centennial of that battle, And because we knew that it still had such an effect on people alive today, this was one of the things that we asked people about in our interviews. We asked them questions like, do people in your community still know about this? Are young people still learning about it today? And how has it affected you and your family personally? The goal in this piece was not to retell the story of the battle, but rather to provide a bit of a snapshot of what it may still mean to people today on the occasion of its centennial. And we premiered the piece in which we attempted to do this at the St. John's International Sound Symposium in 2016 with our friend James Hurley on piano and Steve performing on guitar. We're going to play you an example now from about the first minute and a half or so of the piece, and in this part, the instruments haven't entered yet. It's solely electronic at this point, but we'll hear another example later with the instruments.
Well, you can always learn from the past.
Because my sister told me her and her husband went there, but they were elderly, but she said that they were brought to tears when they visited this broken town.
Young people would be more, aware of ISIS and Iraq and Afghanistan than they would pull that ammo.
You can always learn from the past.
So, in the current project, we felt it was very important to have a performer to create a human connection with the audience. And so that's Steve. The guitar, we feel, is an ideal instrument for the project, and to talk a little bit about why, I'm going to turn it over to him.
Thank you, Jason. Hello, everyone. So as a guitarist, this project has been very exciting for me to try many different ways to musically interact with speech. And as Jason said, we found many elements and techniques that make it ideal for this kind of project. First, the guitar has a very wide range, not as wide as the piano, but it spans about 4 octaves. So if we plan to imitate or work with anybody from a very deep voice to maybe children with very high voices, it's all within the range of the guitar. Despite the presence of frets on the instrument, which fix the pitch to notes, again, much like the piano is fixed, continuous pitch is achievable on the guitar through string bending or the use of a glass slide, which you will see me demonstrate shortly. Because as people are speaking, we're rarely hitting these fixed notes of A, B, and C. We're often somewhere in between. So the guitar is quite able to reach all of these different pitches. It is also both a melodic and harmonic instrument. So I could play a melody on a single line. I could also play a full sounding harmony consisting up to 6 different pitches. And the melodic aspect of people speaking is quite obvious how we could work with that. But we've also, in some of the technologies we've been using, managed to extract harmonies from people's voice. So that's been an interesting thing we can do with the guitar as well. I've been experimenting with both electric and classical guitar. As you can see on the floor here, maybe I have some effects pedals, and I have a whole array of gadgets over there, which again produce a wide variety of sounds. Electric guitar with technology is basically limitless these days. It's more like a synthesizer with any kind of tone you can imagine available with some clicks and some pedals. So that really opens up a lot of doors. As well with the classical guitar, some of the different timbres we play have been associated with speech sounds. If you pluck the string over the sound hole, you get a round, very warm sound, which is sometimes described as being like a vowel, like a ooh or an oh, that kind of sound. And if you pluck near the bridge, where it's bright and has a little more attack, it could resemble consonant sounds. So with the classical guitar, this is an element I think we'll be experimenting with in future installments of the project. Lastly, and most importantly, is probably the association of the guitar with folk music. It is probably the definitive instrument, along with fiddle and accordion, for folk music in Newfoundland. Many people are still, as Jason mentioned, this tradition is still very alive and well in Newfoundland, not just amongst the older generation, but in the town of Branch, for example, the weekend activity was for the young people to go down to the beach and sing the local songs. And there is a lexicon of folk tunes that are well known to people of the province and well known outside. So in our piece, One Foot in the Past, where you just heard some speech samples from, there was also a section where the pianist and I are kind of passing back and forth these little fragments of Newfoundland folk songs. And you probably can't read the words, but that's kind of what these little graphics are here. They're little musical fragments, and we're kind of, as I said, passing them back and forth in an interesting way. So I'm just going to play a little bit about that to show the folk song implementation in this song. And that will be... So to me, as someone who's especially familiar with these songs, because of these varying keys and tempi, it has a very nostalgic effect. It's as if these little fragments or memories of these tunes are swimming around in your head. And this element of nostalgia, I think, is something that's achievable through future uses of either folk-style guitar playing and interesting settings of folk songs as well. So that's something we plan to revisit in the future. But as I mentioned, this piece today is more based around the electric guitar. So I'm going to hand it back to Jason now, and we'll demonstrate some of the stuff we've been working on for this piece.
So as I mentioned, we're using primarily 3 different clips in the movement that we're going to talk about, and they're chosen for rhythm, for melody, and for harmony. The first one is based on rhythm, which I think is one that we all have a pretty intuitive sense of. You're all aware of the pacing of syllables or the accented versus non-accented syllables when you listen to a person speak. And we can transcribe that pretty well, pretty accurately in a lot of cases. And what you're about to hear from the guitar is created with muted strings where there's not a very strong sense of pitch, but on the accented syllables there's a harmonic to bring that sense of accent out. But the delivery is not really pitch specific. We might approximately follow the contour of the speech, but not its specific pitches. We're really emphasizing the rhythm here. And for those of you who can read music, you can see that the first 2 bars of this transcription fit very neatly into a compound meter with a 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 4, 3, 3 kind of thing. And it requires a bit of a tempo change when you get to the last part of the phrase, but it all works very well in standard musical notation. And here's what it sounds like.
Change, that's what it's a change. It wouldn't be good that we live like we did.
And on the guitar. So the second aspect is the melody of dialect. And here we need to get back into the idea of spectral analysis again. What you see there is another kind of stylized spectrogram, not so different from the one that we saw earlier, but this one is generated with a different software called SPEAR, and SPEAR stands for Sinusoidal Partial Editing, Analysis, and Resynthesis. And basically, what SPEAR does is when it takes an incoming sound file, it breaks it down into sinusoidal tracks. So like all of these are simple sine tones, whether they're gray or dark gray or red. And real sound is not exactly like that, especially if you've got a very noisy sound. It doesn't always break down very neatly into sinusoidal tracks, but SPEAR analyzes it as if it did. And so what you end up with is this analysis of speech where you can isolate individual partials and hear what they sound like individually if you want. So we're going to hear the one in red right now. Okay. Now that's at about half speed, so I'll just give you a sense of what it sounds like at normal speed. And now, if I select a couple of the other strong ones, sounds like this. Already starts to have something of a vocal timbre, I think. And if we fill that out a little bit more, we get starting to get a sense of vowel, maybe. And if we zoom out and even select a whole region of frequencies like this, then we get... And if now we listen to the entire thing...
So we were always kind of steeped in the past a little bit more.
Okay. But SPEAR gives us the amazing ability to zoom into just one of those tracks at a time. And for the sake of performance facility on the guitar, we've chosen to slow the tempo down a bit and to focus on just these couple of partial tracks that I started with, this one right here and this one right here. And I'm going to play it for you one more time, and then Steve's going to play something similar on the guitar. So quite similar, I think. And this gives us a good basis for the guitar to interact with the partials of speech. And so we can select from among the partials and combine them as we choose to artistically with the guitar in real time. And just to look like, to show you what that looks like in notation, it didn't really work very well to try and notate this one track at a time as a melodic figure in conventional notation, because you're often dealing with very subtle gradations of pitch. You know, it's not a whole semitone, it's a very small interval that you often have to bend. So what we decided to do was expand the staff like this so that each line represents a distinct semitone, and where the note begins is indicated with a note head followed by a contour of glissando with the thickness of the line as an indication of the volume as it evolves over the course of the track. And so he doesn't have to re-attack for every word, only the ones that sounded like they were strong attacks in the speech based on our judgment. And as we heard in the example, the timbre of the guitar, if we choose to set it up that way, can approximate a sine tone pretty convincingly. So next, we have the harmony of dialect. So this one is maybe even a little bit less intuitive, but digital analysis can be used to identify these partials within the sound of the voice, and it is actually kind of amazing how similar they can sometimes be to traditional chords on a guitar. And the guitar is also capable of simulating what we call jitter. And basically, even when a voice sounds like it's sustaining a pitch, there's always a certain amount of micro-fluctuation within the voice and within the partials of the voice. And without that, voices would sound very flat and very mechanical and not very lifelike. So with the guitar and the performer's fingers on the guitar, he can bend them just a little bit here and there to create this sense of jitter. And I'm going to go back to Spear one more time to give you one more demonstration. So the ones that I've selected here are tones taken from this sample, and here's what they sound like all together. So for those of you who know music theory at all, that's basically a straight up G dominant seventh chord in a particular type of voicing. And if we go back to the slide and hear the original sound, I will never hear this again without hearing a G dominant seventh chord now.
Today's technology and everything, you have to, don't you? You don't have to forget though the past.
It's really just those first two notes where he's very stable on the pitch, but that sounds, the spectrum as revealed in the analysis is very close to a traditional chord on the guitar, which would sound like this. Okay. And so the last thing that I want to highlight is to come back to this idea of soundscape, which we also were using in this piece. We felt this was appropriate because Newfoundland identity is very deeply connected to the natural landscape. And of course, seabirds are very common and a big part of what you encounter when you go out in the natural landscape in Newfoundland. And the guitar is capable of pretty convincingly imitating at least some of them. So in the short sound clip I'm going to play right now, you're going to hear seagulls, which you probably are familiar with, and gannets, which you might be less familiar with. So these have a very granular, grainy kind of call as so. And Steve? So there's our gull. And there's our gannet. And so sometimes these are precisely notated like this, and sometimes he has a choice between a few different characteristic figures that he can freely move between. And sometimes in the electronics you'll hear flocks of birds that also blend well with the sound of crowds of people. And so between the bird sounds, the guitar sounds, and the vocal sounds, they can transform back and forth between one another, which is what we've tried to do in this piece, which we are proud to premiere for you right now. This is Take Me Back.
Yes, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Change, that's why it's a change. It wouldn't be good that we live like we did.
We were all kind of seeking past a little bit more. Seeking past a little bit more.
Technology and everything, you know, you have to, don't you? You know, you don't have to forget the whole past. Today's technology and everything, you know, you have to, don't you? You don't have to forget the whole past. Technology and everything, you know, you have to, don't you? You know, you don't have to forget the whole past. You don't have to forget the whole